Hello, my name is Corey Schell, and I'm a senior cybersecurity consultant with Dean Dorton. And today we're going to be discussing how you can assess and mitigate risk in Azure and Office 365. And this is really intended to be a beginner's guide for anyone who, even those without any technical knowledge of security pertaining to Office 365. So let's discuss the goals of this presentation. My goal for this presentation is that everyone who attends this presentation is going to have a better understanding of the most common risks and issues that we observe as assessors of cloud environments, regardless of whatever your technical expertise is. And then if you're a stakeholder or an influencer within your organization, my goal is that you're going to have a better understanding of what your top focus areas should be to mitigate risk in the cloud and what Microsoft licenses might be required to help you achieve that. And then lastly, if you're an auditor or you're an assessor like myself of a cloud environment, I'm hoping that you'll learn something new and you're going to know, as an outcome of this presentation, where to find guidance on those industry best practices for managing risk in the cloud. And the objectives of the presentation, so we're going to start with reviewing cloud security risk at a very high level, and we'll go over some data breach statistics. And then we'll move to some of the common observations of issues or default configuration settings that I observe regularly as an assessor of cloud environments. And then lastly, we're going to discuss in much more depth the concepts of multi-factor authentication, good password security. We'll define what the Microsoft Secure Score is and how you can track it. We'll go over various licensing for Office 365, and I'll provide a couple of references that might be helpful for you to better understand the entitlements that you get with your licenses, or maybe what the most cost-effective approach for you is based on what your needs are. Then we'll discuss advanced threat protection. We'll define what that is. And then we'll discuss the Azure AD premium features that most tenants, unless you purchase those Azure AD premium licenses, we'll discuss what those features are and what's included with them. And then we'll close with some references for industry best practices for managing risk in the cloud. Okay, so we'll start with attacks on the cloud. According to the research for Microsoft, in a single year, they observed about a 300% increase in attacks against Office 365 tenants. About 23 million compromised accounts as a result of phishing were detected in a single month. 350,000 accounts that were compromised from a password spray attack, and I'll define that in a bit more depth later. And then 4.6 billion fraudulent sign-in attempts in a single month across all Office 365 tenants. So the attacks on cloud environments, specifically Office 365 and Azure, are increasing pretty substantially. And moving to some additional data breach statistics, when we look at the data, there's about 300 million fraudulent sign-in attempts every day. And when you look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, about 81% of data breaches are the result of credential theft. So identities being guessed, or passwords being stolen, or passwords being guessed. And according to Microsoft, about 99% of these attacks can be mitigated by adopting multi-factor authentication. And I've got a quote here from the latest Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, but they state that phishing is responsible for the vast majority of breaches pertaining to like business email compromises, and that attack scenario reflects a meteoric rise in misrepresentation. So impersonation, basically, it's impersonation attacks that social engineer users, and they state that a related result that will likely not be surprising is that this year Cloud assets were much more common than on-premises assets in both incidents and breaches. And they state, if it was not obvious by now, cloud assets deserve a seat at the grown-up security table and a piece of your budget pie. So if you're not budgeting for cloud security risk, you really ought to be, especially if you're moving a lot of your assets and data to the cloud. All right, we'll move on to some common observations, issues, and misconfigurations that we typically see when we review Office 365 environments. So we'll start with auditing settings. So by default in Office 365, as it is today, the unified audit log is disabled. And unless an administrator logs in and enables the unified audit log, then if there's an incident or there's a need to access events within the unified audit log, those logs may not be accessible. Another very important consideration is that unless you have the proper licenses, there's a specific attribute that I'll go in a bit more depth on later that's not accessible. So if you're trying to ascertain what items were viewed or accessed within a mailbox that was compromised, if you don't have that license and you don't have that feature enabled at the time of the incident, you may not be able to determine what was accessed, and you will probably have to assume that everything within the mailbox was potentially compromised. The next common observation is a low rate of adoption for multi-factor authentication. So we'll go over in a bit more depth later what multi-factor authentication is, but that's relying on more than one factor to prove you are who you say you are. Most data breaches and cybersecurity incidents involving the cloud are a result of multi-factor authentication not being enforced. And this is especially important for any accounts that are highly privileged, especially global administrator accounts. You want to be sure that you're enforcing multi-factor for those highly privileged users because they have access to a lot of data, or pretty much all data in some cases within the tenant. And then the next issue is legacy protocols are enabled, and this is again a default setting. And threat actors will target those legacy protocols. Even if you have multi-factor authentication in place, they can target mailboxes with these legacy protocols and potentially gain access to the data within those mailboxes and use those mailboxes to attack your customers or your partners or other organizations that you have a relationship with. Okay, other observations is that we typically see that the Microsoft Secure Score is not maintained, and in many cases, the organizations are unaware of its existence. So that's an important concept that we'll cover later about how you can track your Secure Score and maintain it to make sure that you're focusing on focus areas that can mitigate risk and improve your security posture. And then also there's a concept called the principle of least privilege, where you only assign roles to users or groups based on their business need. And it's very common for us to see that IT administrators don't have separate accounts for privileged access. In many cases, their regular user account that they use for their mailbox and for standard user activity is assigned as a global administrator, and that's not the best way to do things. Another common issue is that by default, all users are able to grant consent to unmanaged applications. And that presents a lot of risk because the bad guys are starting to go after users by convincing them to register a malicious application rather than give up their credentials. So threat actors are phishing users, getting them to register a malicious application, and that can potentially allow the bad guy to get access to their data or even impersonate them, even if they've got a strong password and even if they have multi-factor authentication. So we'll discuss later how you can review that and how you can change it. And then also another common issue is that IT staff are occasionally unable to retrieve sign-in logs or investigate risk events with the proper context due to inadequate licensing. And that's because not all Office 365 licenses include Azure AD Premium, and that is a necessary license to get additional context for risky sign-ins. And we'll go over that in much more depth later. but we're going to touch on auditing real quick. As I mentioned before, the unified audit log in Office 365 is not enabled by default. That may change in the very near future, hopefully, but at this time, if your organization has not taken the step to actually assess and ensure that that is enabled, I highly recommend you do check it. And then mailbox auditing for Exchange mailboxes in Office 365. It used to be that mailbox auditing was not enabled, and you had to proactively enable it to get all of those relevant logs for the mailboxes. But Microsoft did enable that by default a couple of years ago. But I still do recommend you check and make sure there's no issues or misconfigurations there, and that mailbox auditing is enabled in your tenant. And I'm going to give you very specific instructions on how to enable the unified audit log here in another slide. But the other consideration for you is, let's say under a hypothetical scenario, you have an employee who their password is guessed or their password is stolen, and a hacker, a threat actor, accesses their Exchange mailbox. And so you're trying to ascertain, okay, what did the bad guy access within their mailbox? If you don't have an E5 or an E5 compliance subscription for that user's mailbox, and you don't have that feature enabled, you will not be able to make that determination. And unfortunately, this is not something that you can do retroactively. So you need to have that, if you want to be able to answer that question, you need to make sure this license and the feature is enabled. So do recommend you do consider that, maybe procuring that license at least for very important people within the organization, so that if you ever encounter that scenario, you're not left having to go with the assumption that every item in the mailbox was potentially compromised. And as far as how you can enable the unified audit log, if it's not enabled within your tenant, I've got a link at the bottom of the slide on the bottom left-hand corner, but if you log into protection.office.com/unified audit log, if it's not enabled in your tenant, as soon as a global administrator navigates there, you'll see that at the top here that you need to turn on auditing. And then after you turn it on, it'll change and say, okay, you'll be able to search for user and admin activity within a couple of hours. So it's really just as simple as clicking a button to turn it on, and that's where you would go to check it. Okay, next we're going to discuss a very important concept called it's multi-factor authentication. And to define MFA, what is it? It's either something you know, something you have, and something you are. And if we break those down into the most common things, the most common thing that you know when you try to prove your identity to any information system is a password. And passwords are inherently insecure because they're easily guessed and stolen through various means like malware or through phishing. Something you have is most commonly a device like your cell phone. It could be an authenticator app on your phone. And then something you are, that is typically biometric data. So think of that as like a fingerprint, Face ID, Touch ID on a phone. And the important consideration for you here is you want at least 2 out of 3 of these things. If you're relying on just a password to prove you are who you say you are, you're likely to have a data breach or a cybersecurity incident at some point in time. It's almost inevitable. And then another very important consideration is if you have cybersecurity insurance and you're fortunate or lucky enough to get insurance today without having multi-factor authentication, you very likely are going to have a lot of trouble getting a renewal or finding an insurance provider to insure you in the marketplace if you're not requiring multi-factor authentication for your Office 365 environment. And whenever you enable multi-factor authentication in your tenant, there's a few different methods that you can allow your employees to use. The most common are cell phone. They can get a phone call or an SMS text message, or an authenticator app. You can download and install a free app from the iOS App Store or Google Play Store and use that so that when a user logs in with their password in Office 365, they get a push notification on their phone, or they get a phone call or a text message, and then they will respond to that. That way, if their password's ever guessed or stolen, the bad guy wouldn't have everything that he needs to access their account without that second factor. And looking at from what Microsoft has published, only 11% of Office 365 administrative accounts require multi-factor authentication. Those numbers as are of January 2020, and that was an increase in just maybe 5 or 6 percentage points from 2018. So I still think that adoption would not be much higher today if Microsoft were to publish additional data on that metric. Okay, we're going to move on to password security, and this is usually everybody's favorite topic is passwords. As an assessor of cloud environments and organizations' internal password policies, it's very common for us to see the password policy here, like the screenshot here of Active Directory with these settings. And the problem is, even if you require or you enforce complexity in Active Directory that makes the user pick a password that's requires 3 of the 4 upper, lower, number special, you always end up with weak password phrases like you see here. So password 1 exclamation, welcome 1, summer, spring, winter, 2022 exclamation, those very common formulas. And that typically results in bad outcomes, especially if you don't do some of the other things that we're going to talk about later, like disabling legacy protocols to protect against password sprays. The bottom line here is, if you want to achieve better outcomes, there are better ways to enforce good password security requirements than what we've typically done in the past. You can do that through training, and you can do that through password filters, actually technical controls. So for administrators, if you're someone within your organization that manages passwords or enforces password requirements for your organization, these are the recommendations from Microsoft. They do recommend you maintain an 8-character minimum length requirement. I would recommend you go a step above that and at least do a 9-character minimum. But they, according to their research, they say that the longer passwords aren't always necessarily better depending on the context. And then they also state you should not require character composition requirements. So this contradicts what we've been, saying for years within the industry. But what they're saying here is, if you can do these other things listed here, then you don't really have to worry as much about the character complexity. You don't have to, worry about doing, okay, you have to use special characters. The other thing here is they say don't require mandatory periodic password resets for user accounts. So what they're saying here is don't require passwords to expire every 60 or 90 days. The reason they are saying that is because if you look at the research, when you require people to reset their passwords frequently, every 2 or 3 months, then people will pick a formula and they will usually just slightly alter that formula every 2-3 months. And that tends to actually lead to them using more insecure or weaker passwords. Whereas if you take the approach of not making them reset their passwords frequently, they're more likely to pick a very good password or even a passphrase that they don't have to change as often. So it's likely to be much better and much stronger. So, all of that, especially saying don't do complexity, don't do password expiration, is contingent on these other things here. So they want you to ban common passwords. So actually prevent your users from changing their password to something weak. And you do that by implementing a password filtering solution in your identity system, like within Active Directory, so that if you have a user that tries to reset their password, they're not going to be able to pick one of those weak common passwords. You also need to enforce registration for multi-factor authentication for everyone, especially for access through VPN, VDI, Office 365. And if you can meet all the requirements on this list, you'd be surprised just how unimportant it is to have, those older requirements like, frequent password resets and complexity. And to further add to this point, there was a person, his name's Alex Weinert. He's with Microsoft's Identity Division, and he wrote an article called Your Password Doesn't Matter. And I've linked to that article at the bottom left of this slide. But some of the key points from him that he goes over is that focusing on password rules rather than things that really help protect your organization from business disruption or data breach, like multi-factor authentication and good threat detection are just distractions. So only in very specific use cases like password spray attacks or offline password cracking attacks does the password really have any bearing at all in the attack vector. So as long as you're doing things like disabling those legacy protocols in Office 365, like IMAP, POP, SMTP, and you're turning on multi-factor authentication for everybody, then really the password policy is not as important. And looking at the research, they state that you're about 99% less likely to be compromised if you have multi-factor authentication. So, focusing on the passwords, it's not as important in Office 365 as long as you're doing those other things. Now, Microsoft does have a password filtering solution. If you have Azure AD Premium that you're entitled to, that does integrate with your on-premises Active Directory. So you can actually use this solution with Microsoft to prevent your employees from changing their passwords to weak and common formulas through Microsoft's banned password list. And then you can also set up your own custom banned password list. So let's say the name of your company's Acme. You could include the word Acme within your banned password list, so you don't have employees picking Acme 1234 type passwords. And if you don't have the Azure AD Premium licenses, there's also other commercial password filtering solutions. I've got links to those on this slide that you should probably consider. Some of these solutions, like Anixis, integrate with very popular breach password lists like Have I Been Pwned? So these are both really good solutions to look at and to consider. Now, best practices for passwords, and I mean this this is really kind of focused on how you manage your passwords in a secure manner, in your personal life, as well as for if you've got multiple accounts you have to manage, with your business accounts. Longer passwords are typically better and more difficult to break offline in a targeted offline password cracking attack. 8-character passwords can typically be broken in less than a day. And again, this is assuming that a bad guy's achieved that password hash list and they're trying to crack it offline. So if you're really wanting to be secure, the Department of Defense does recommend 15-character passwords or more. And if possible, the more length in the password, the more secure it is. And it really becomes very onerous and very difficult to set these really long or random passwords unless you're using a password manager. So my recommendation would be for you to look at a password manager solution. I'll go over the various ones available to you on another slide. But these password managers allow you to set long and random passwords for different accounts. And you also want to make sure each of these passwords are unique, and because a lot of people, and this is a very human thing to do, will use the same password in multiple places. And if you're reusing the same password in multiple places, all it takes is for one of your accounts to get hacked, and the bad guys are going to take that password from that one compromised account you have and try it in multiple other places for your account. So if you have a habit of reusing the same password in multiple places, that can result in your accounts being breached. So with the password manager, that'll actually help you track all of your passwords and make sure that they're unique and you're not sharing them in other places. You also want to keep your passwords private and not share your passwords over insecure channels. Don't share passwords over email, and it really would be better or more ideal. If you're going to share passwords, it would be best to share them with your password manager. And I mentioned before, there's a bunch of password managers on the market. The most popular are probably 1Password or LastPass. There's also open source solutions, not instead of commercial solutions, like KeePass. And these allow you to generate secure passwords based on any criteria. Remember all of your passwords for you, and make sure that they're all unique. And so one of the common questions that we usually get pertaining to password managers is, should we really be putting all of our eggs in one basket? And my response to that, I would just quote Troy Hunt, who maintains that Have I Been Pwned website. He says that password managers don't have to be perfect. They just have to be better than not having one. And I really agree with them. They're much better than the alternative of using the same or similar password in multiple places. And this is a pretty important event. So last year, the largest collection of passwords was published to the internet. It was over 8.4 billion passwords that were posted on a hacker forum. This accounts for, it's basically 2 passwords for every internet user in the world. So it's a very large password list. And we have seen an increase in password guessing attacks through various ways like password sprays and credential stuffing since this occurred. So this is one of the reasons multi-factor authentication and blocking those legacy authentication protocols and using password filtering solutions are so important. So legacy authentication, pretty much 100% of these online password guessing attacks called password sprays are targeting these legacy authentication protocols. And these are protocols that don't support MFA. So it could be protocols like IMAP, POP, SMTP. And if you're not blocking those protocols within your tenant, then you're likely to have password guessing attacks against your organization. And it's worth noting that Microsoft observed a few 100,000 compromised accounts just in a single month from those password spray attacks. And when we look at the passwords that they're using to target those accounts, they're using these very common formulas that we see in pretty much every organization that we assess. And if you want to prevent them from selecting those weak formulas, then you need to implement a password filter solution and also educate your users with security awareness, not to select those common and weak formulas. And once you do those things, it's not important to require the character composition requirements or frequent password resets for them after you do that. And yeah, just to kind of summarize what we've discussed on how you can mitigate password spray attacks. The first thing, you need to disable those legacy protocols. You should take a look in the logs in your tenant and check to see what accounts might be using those protocols before you do that, so that you don't potentially cause any disruption to certain users or accounts that need a legacy protocol for a specific business reason. You need to implement MFA on all external systems, including VPN, email, virtual desktop infrastructure. You want to use password filters. You want to increase your alerting and monitoring. So use some of these tools we're going to talk about here in just a minute, and make sure that people are monitoring those tools and getting alerts whenever there's risky sign-ins or risky sign-in activity. And then there's some additional access controls you can implement. We'll cover in more depth. And then if you discover any accounts that may be potentially compromised, there's a process you should go through to reset the credentials for those accounts. Okay, we'll move on to Microsoft Secure Score. So there's really 3 different types of Microsoft Secure Score, and I've got links to all 3 of them here on this slide. And really what it is, this is a score from Microsoft that shows you, based on your licensing and based on your control implementation, where are your risks? Like, is your risk mostly within the identity domain? Is it mostly within the data, device, or app category? And they will give you focus areas. So areas of focus for you to improve your score and reduce risk. So the things that are typically near the top of the list are, be sure that you're requiring multi-factor authentication for your employees, making sure that the auditing is enabled, making sure that you're not allowing users to grant consent to risky applications. And it's worth noting that if you're using a third-party product, like let's say you use Duo or Okta to enforce MFA for your organization, Microsoft doesn't have a way to track that within their platform if you're using something aside from them to enforce those requirements. So if you use a third-party product, I would recommend that you do update this and just make a note that we're using a third-party product for this so that you get your points updated and you get credit for the implementation of that control. But this is a wonderful tool for you to assess what your focus areas and what your risks are within your cloud environment, and it's absolutely free. Okay, moving to application consent. So, we're seeing as more organizations enroll their users in multi-factor authentication, we're seeing more attacks that leverage OAuth phishing attacks. So they're phishing emails that prompt the victim to register a malicious application that has access to their data and can impersonate them. So when this happens, even if a user has multi-factor authentication, this could potentially allow a bad guy to access their account, access their data, and target other organizations with that person's account. And the reason for that is because by default in Azure, there's a feature here that says users can consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf. By default, that is set to yes. So any user within the organization can grant consent to any application, and the bad guys are taking advantage of that. So how you fix that is you change that toggle that I've highlighted in red there from a yes to a no, and you set up an approval process for whenever users go to ask to grant consent to an application, that'll go to someone that can review and approve it, like an administrator. Or alternatively, I've included this on the right-hand side of the slide. If you follow these instructions, you log into Azure, you can change that to allow user consent for apps from verified publishers for low-risk permissions. And that should also mitigate a lot of these attacks we see with these malicious applications. But highly recommend you do that, because if you don't, you are likely to encounter phishing attacks that may be successful, even if you've gone the step of enforcing multi-factor authentication for your organization. So the next topic is licensing. So Microsoft's licensing is very confusing. They've got a bunch of different SKUs that grant you all different kinds of entitlement. So there's a couple of different resources I wanted to provide. If you look at the bottom left-hand side of this slide, there's a link to m365maps.com, and they've got really good documentation on which licenses grant you which features. So I recommend checking that out if you're wanting to gain a better understanding of what features are included with which licenses. And then there's also another useful resource. I've linked to it at the bottom of the slide from Infused Innovations. And they've got a really good breakdown of what the typical retail, nonprofit, and EDU price of these licenses are, and they kind of a cross map between these are the features that are included with these licenses. And one of the takeaways, if you look at these licenses, there's an equation here that'll be helpful for you to remember. Office 365 plus EMS, or that stands for Enterprise Mobility and Security, plus Windows 10 equals Microsoft 365. So it's basically that blue column equals the orange column plus green plus yellow. So very, very easy formula to remember if you're trying to understand, how these licenses work. Okay, we'll move on to advanced threat protection. So with advanced threat protection, if you look at Microsoft's security stack, it really consists of 4 different components. And those components are, they want to help you protect your cloud environment, your endpoints, your identities, and your email. And so if we look at the old names for that stack and what they were called, it used to be that Microsoft called the component that protects your cloud applications, cloud app security. The component that protects your endpoints, what used to be called Defender ATP. The component that protects your email used to be called Office 365 ATP. And the component that protects your identity used to be called Azure ATP. And they've changed their naming scheme. So this is what it's called now. So it's Defender for Endpoint instead of Defender ATP. It's Defender for Office 365 instead of Office 365 ATP. And it's Defender for Identity instead of Azure ATP. And they did this to try and simplify things so people wouldn't be as confused about those components and about what ATP meant. And so there's a diagram here on this slide. I've got a link to it at the bottom of the slide. But this shows you a typical attack chain that starts with a bad guy sending a malicious email, whether it's a hyperlink in an email, whether it's a malicious email attachment. And that advanced email protection solution, Defender for Office 365, is what is supposed to help you protect your users from email-based threats. So what happens if that solution fails and a user opens up a malicious email attachment? Well, then you're moving on to that next advanced threat protection control within this stack, which is Defender for Endpoint. And this could be, fill in the blank here. So let's say you don't use Microsoft's advanced email solution. Let's say you use Proofpoint or Mimecast or some other vendor. The point is you want to use some of those advanced threat protection controls to protect you from malicious emails. And if that fails, then you want some type of other advanced email protection or endpoint protection solution to protect your endpoints. And let's say you've got a user who the email protection fails and they open up a malicious attachment, and then that attachment starts to beacon home to the command and control. Well, what's next? Okay, the bad guy is going to try and move further on in that attack chain. If you've got some of these other tools in place, like Azure AD Identity Protection, or if you've got Microsoft Defender for Identity, those controls might allow you to detect an attack that has bypassed those other layers of controls, the email and the endpoint-based security. So do recommend you check this out. Check out that link at the bottom for additional information on the Microsoft 365 Defender stack. But really the point of this slide is you want to use multiple layers of advanced threat protection solutions as a defense in depth strategy. Okay, we'll move on to Azure AD Premium and what features are included with that. So Azure AD Premium comes in two different licenses. There's a P1 and a P2 license, and I've got a list of the entitlements that are included with those licenses. So we'll discuss in a bit more depth Azure Privileged Identity Management, Conditional Access, Azure Identity Protection, and then Azure AD Password Protection. So Azure Privileged Identity Management, what this feature allows you to do is instead of your privileged users being assigned permanent, 24/7 highly privileged access or highly privileged roles, it allows you to assign access based on business need just in time. So the way it would work if you implement this solution is that, let's say you've got a user, John Smith, that occasionally he has a need to manage Exchange or he has a need to manage SharePoint. Rather than making him an Exchange or SharePoint admin permanently, you can make him eligible for those roles. And whenever he needs those roles for a specific business reason, he can request approval, and then you can have someone who reviews that approval request and approves it. And then he'll be delegated that role for a specific duration of time. It could be, a day, it could be just several hours to do whatever he needs to do. And then he could also be prompted to, register or authenticate with multi-factor authentication to activate that role. So This helps you mitigate risk with your privileged accounts or having your privileged accounts compromised because they're not permanently assigned highly privileged roles. You're only delegating them based on business need, and you're doing it for a specific duration, a much more limited duration of time. And I should add, if you're an organization that has like a change approval board or some type of CAB in your organization, this is definitely a feature you should look at, and it is included with Azure AD Premium P2 licenses. The next feature that is very helpful is called conditional access. So conditional access policies, really to simply define them, are if-then statements. So if person A wants to access this resource, then they must complete this action. So most of the common conditional access policies that you can implement, you can enforce multi-factor authentication for users that have administrative roles. You can block sign-ins for legacy authentication protocols that we commonly see the bad guys attack, legacy protocols. You can, enforce multi-factor authentication for all remote access. So any access outside of your organization's network. You can also block risky sign-ins, and you can require users to log in from company managed devices. So there's really a lot of things you can do with this feature that you have to have Azure AD Premium to use this feature. So if you're not already using a third-party platform for multi-factor authentication or risk-based multi-factor authentication, I do recommend you do take a look at it. And I've got some links at the bottom of this slide that cover this concept in much more depth. So before you go implementing these policies, there's a few things you should consider before you do it. The first thing is you should enable any conditional access policy that you set up. You want to be sure to set it in report-only mode first. So that way you can go back and review sign-in logs and assess the potential impact of that policy before you enforce it. So I highly recommend you do that because you don't want to end up in a situation where you set up a policy and you don't test it and you enforce it and cause disruption to the business. And then the next thing for you to consider, Microsoft has a tool called the What If tool. And this tool allows you to set up hypothetical scenarios based on certain criteria like the user, their public IP address, their geographic location, the application that they're using, to see what the impact of a policy would be, and to make sure that your conditional access policies are implemented appropriately and that they're effective and that there's no misconfigurations. So definitely, you need to use those two things, report only and what if tool, before you go enforcing those policies. And then lastly, you should create emergency access accounts. Microsoft refers to these as break glass accounts. You need at least one emergency access account to be excluded from all these conditional access policies. And the reason that they recommend that is if you enforce the policy on everyone, including all administrators, without any exceptions, it is possible if you misconfigure that policy to inadvertently lock everybody out of your tenant. And that has happened probably dozens of times. And you don't want to end up in a situation where everybody's locked out of Office 365 and you're waiting on Microsoft to resolve that issue for you for maybe hours. So to avoid that, do these three things. Okay, the next feature that's included with Azure AD Premium is called identity protection. And there's really three things that this tool allows you to accomplish. That allows you to automate the detection and remediation of risks that Azure detects, investigate risks using the data that's within the portal, and then you can also export that data to a SIEM solution if you have a SIEM solution. If you're using this feature, then you're going to get a bit much more context on potentially risky sign-ins that include, someone using an IP proxy or anonymizer to try and hide their IP address, someone who's logged in from a location that they don't typically travel to. if they've logged in from a location that has been linked to malware, if they're logging in using an application that has unfamiliar sign-in properties, if their credentials have been leaked to the internet, so like have their credentials been leaked to a hacker forum on the dark web or something like that. And then also if you've got users who are having their passwords sprayed because you haven't disabled those legacy protocols, you may also get some detections on that as well. And then if you're using the full identity protection solution, if you've got those Azure AD Premium P2 licenses, then you get this. You'll get more context on those risk events within Azure. It categorizes them based on low, medium, or high risk. And you'll be able to set up policies that will do an action for you automatically, like block access, based on that risk severity. So you could do, if there's a high risk event, automatically block access for that user. That way you're not waiting for an administrator or somebody to respond to that risky sign-in. And then you also, for administrators within your environment, once you enable this feature, they'll begin to receive a weekly digest email that goes over all the risk events for that week. And if there's any risks generated in identity protection, they will get email alerts. So they can be much more proactive at responding to those risky sign-ins within Azure. And just to show you the difference, I've got a screenshot here of risky sign-ins in Azure with Azure AD Basic and Azure AD Free accounts. There's really not a whole lot of context. You know, if you've been tasked with reviewing these risky sign-in logs and you just got a basic or a free license, you'll see a username, you may see an IP address and a location, and that's it. There's no additional context. So it can be a very frustrating experience if you're trying to get additional information on those risk events. But with an Azure AD Premium license, that unlocks this paywall of, you know, all of this additional context on what was the level of risk for this event. Was it medium risk? Was it high risk? You get additional information, you know, based on the client application, you know, the user that was accessing it. There's just a lot more context here if you're trying to ascertain, okay, was this a false positive? Was this a true positive? So having those licenses is very helpful when reviewing those events. Okay, and we're getting to near the end of the presentation, but I want to go over some industry best practices, and this is especially important for those of you that might be an assessor or an auditor of cloud environments. And even if you're not an assessor or auditor, if you're a stakeholder within your business, and if I could give you just a single slide out of this presentation for you to follow up on, it would be this slide here. This is your checklist. These are the resources that are available to you, to assess how effective your cloud security is, and the things you need to focus on to mitigate risk within your Azure and Office 365 environments. Microsoft has a security roadmap, what your top priorities for the first month, the first 90 days and beyond should be. They've also got a good blog entry on what the top 10 ways for you to mitigate risk in Microsoft 365 business plans. There's some really good guidance for recommendations and observations from CISA. I recommend you check out, and that's going to go over everything that we've gone over in this presentation. And then if you haven't yet, check out your Microsoft Secure Score, check out your Identity Secure Score. If you use Azure for your virtual machines or infrastructure, I do recommend you check out the Azure Security Center Secure Score. And then the Center for Internet Security has some benchmarks that are available to you to help you with step-by-step instructions on how you can audit your Microsoft 365 environment or audit your Azure environment. And then lastly, if your organization has not yet adopted multi-factor authentication, you need to do that yesterday. I do not recommend you kick the can down the road. It's pretty much inevitable if you don't have MFA enforced for your cloud tenant today, you will have a cybersecurity incident. It's inevitable. And then you also may have a lot of difficulty either obtaining or renewing your cybersecurity insurance coverage until that's in place. And I've got a link there in this slide that actually links to MFA rollout materials from Microsoft that are free that could be very helpful for you to, whenever you set up your implementation plan and you begin to communicate the changes to your staff. That way you cause the least amount of disruption and confusion to your staff and your business. And with that, I'm going to leave a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions that they would like to ask within the chat. Otherwise, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us Cloud Days with Dean Dorton. I've got my contact information listed here. So if you have any questions you would like to ask me directly, please send me an email at my email address listed there, and I'll respond to you as soon as I can. Thank you very much.